We are now ready for part 3 of our absolute value lesson, comparing and ordering absolute value. But first we're going to check our answers from part 2 on the opposite of. Have your answers ready to check as we go over them. Number 10. The opposite of the absolute value of -8 is going to be -8. Number 11. The opposite of -2.1 is a positive 2.1. Number 12. The opposite of the absolute value of -6 is -6. Number 13. The opposite of 9 is -9. Number 14. The opposite of the absolute value of 5.3 is a -5.3. Number 15. The opposite of the absolute value of 1.72 is a -1.72. Just remember, if you have a negative sign on the outside of your absolute value bars, your answer is going to be negative. When comparing or ordering the absolute value, evaluate the absolute value first, then compare those values. In example 1, we are going to compare the opposite of the absolute value of 11 to the opposite of the absolute value of 10. I would suggest when you find these values to write it either below or above your absolute values on each side. This will help you to determine whether it's less than, greater than, or equal to. Example 1. The opposite of the absolute value of 11 would be a -11. And the opposite of the absolute value of 10 is a -10. Then you're going to compare your new values, and a -11 is less than a -10. Example 2. The absolute value of -7 is +7. On the other side, the opposite of -6 is 6. I'm going to compare the 7 to the 6. 7 is greater than 6. Number 3, the opposite of the absolute value of a -43 would be a -43. The opposite of -43 is a +43. When you compare these two, a -43 is less than a +43. You can see how writing in these values is going to help you so you don't get confused. When we order numbers from least to greatest or greatest to least, it's also a very good idea to go ahead and write the values of each of them. So we're going to do that first. The opposite of -4 is 4. The absolute value of 3 is 3. The opposite of the absolute value of 10 is -10. And the opposite of the absolute value of -5 would be a -5. Now that I have these values, and I have them in yellow, we are going to put these values in order from least to greatest. So the smallest value is going to be -10, and then we're going to have -5, and then 3, and then 4. But this is not our answer. We have to write our answer back in its original form. So to write these in the original form, my -10 was the opposite of the absolute value of 10. The -5 was the opposite of the absolute value of -5. My 3 was the absolute value of 3, and the 4 was the opposite of -4. So writing it back in its original form from least to greatest is the correct way to do this. Let's do one more example. This time, we are going to order the numbers from greatest to least. So the first thing I'm going to do is find the values. So I have the opposite of -2, which is 2. The absolute value of -6 is 6. This is just in parentheses. There's nothing else with it, so that means it's -1. And then the opposite of the absolute value of -9 is going to be a -9. I'm going to put these answers in order from this time greatest to least. So my greatest is going to be 6, then 2, then -1, then -9. But I need to write them in the original form for my final answer. So my 6 is going to be the absolute value of -6. Then I have the opposite of -2, then -1, and then the opposite of the absolute value of -9. So now we're going to work number 16 through 25. And you can either do this on your notebook paper, or if you have printed the handout, you may do it on that. And then we will check our answers. Go to the next video once you have finished 16 through 25.